All right, let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is going to be Becky Mitchell, and Becky will later introduce Jacob Bornstein, who I guess I just did. Head of the planning section. Is that the technical side? Yeah. Water supply planning section. Thank you, Becky. Head of the water supply planning section for the Colorado Water Conservation Board is Becky Mitchell, and she will lead off for us. Thank you, Becky. Please welcome her. Sorry.
Thanks, and again, I'm Becky Mitchell. I'm the section chief for the water supply planning section at the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and we were the section that was given the task of kind of leading the charge of the water plan. So I first want to thank the Colorado Water Congress for having us here and allowing us to be a large part of their program. And so as we took on this task, it was important to recognize it wasn't just us alone, it was everybody and folks sitting up here and everyone out there. So I wanted to thank everyone, as I always do. But CWCB represents all of the major river basins in the state, along with the city and county of Denver. So we're working on some big things across the state. So over the last couple days, you've probably heard from some of the other staff regarding conservation and land use, water supply, outreach, and education. You might not have realized what you were learning about, but you were really learning about Chapter 10, the Critical Action Plan of Colorado's water plan. So we were trying to break it down in pieces. So today I'm going to go over that a little bit more and get in a little bit more detail, and then talk about two specific what we're calling, could you put back up oh, there it is. Okay, sorry. I only saw me, and that made me uncomfortable. So we're going to go over a couple more wedges in, and I hate calling them wedges. We really looked at them as spokes. We don't know where the wedges came from, but we looked at it as a wheel. And as you took out a spoke, the wheel could still go around, but it may take away from the integrity of the wheel. So you start taking out many spokes, and we begin to have a problem. So we really needed a really multilateral solution plan. So this is where it is. It's important to recognize also with Chapter 10 of the water plan that we didn't just pull these major measurable objectives out of thin air. They really came from Chapter 6 through 9 of the water plan, and that was a very public process and a public approach, and so we pulled together the major themes and major ideas. So there was goals and actions under each of these measurable objectives that really supported where we need to go as a state. So I'm going to go through a couple things. Again, I'm going to brief you. I'm not going to hit every slide, but again, for the supply and demand gap, that was one of the major measurable objectives. So it's, I think, measurable objective A in critical action plan. So Colorado's water plan sets a measurable objective of reducing the projected 2050 M&I gap from as much as 560, there's some movement in that number, to 0 feet by 2030. So I know we've been talking about 2050 a lot, but when it comes to gap, we really felt that we needed to push that forward. So that was important. I think you kind of could infer some of what Taryn Fennessy was talking about this morning, and then in some workshops on Wednesday. She really focused on the supply and demand gap. And so you were learning about that even if you didn't know you were learning about this measurable objective. And then you heard Kevin Reedy talk about conservation and land use yesterday, and the water plan sets a measurable objective to achieve 400,000 acre-feet of M&I water conservation by 2050. For land use, it sets a measurable objective that by 2025, 75% of Coloradans will live in communities that have incorporated water-saving actions into land use planning plans. So currently we're at 12%. So that's a big jump. That's one I'm hoping people keep hounding us on and saying, okay, are we tracking? Are we doing a good job? So we can talk a little bit more about implementation in a little bit, but it's something that we didn't put these measurable objectives out there and say, oh, we're just going to throw them out there. We put them out there so we could be measured. And I don't think we should measure ourselves. This isn't kindergarten. I don't want to measure. I can't grade my own paper. We have to be graded by others. And so sometimes you can't have the inside baseball players grading us. Sometimes we need to be able to put it out there so others can grade us. Jim Lockhead, I'm sure you will. And in terms of agriculture, Colorado's water plan sets an objective that agriculture and economic productivity will keep pace with growing state, national, and global needs, even if some acres go out of production. I think you've heard in the water plan, there was not any movement to go into private property rights. That's not something that we were looking to do. So if ag acres go out of production, that's something that may happen. Our next one. You heard from the infamous Katie McIntyre yesterday on some of our ideas and plans for education and outreach. So Colorado's water plan sets a measurable objective to significantly improve the level of public awareness and engagement regarding water issues statewide by 2020, as determined by water awareness surveys. Colorado's water plan also sets a measurable objective to engage Coloradans statewide on at least 5 key water challenges that should be addressed by 2030. So as we look at water and hydrology and things like this, this realm of public education and outreach was something that the CWCB wasn't accustomed to spending a lot of time on. And so how we measured that was really something that we had to think about. We couldn't say, okay, land use plans, 12% to 75%. This one was a more difficult one for us to figure out how we were going to measure, but I think we did a good job on that, and we expect lots of input and comment as the years go by on how we're doing. The next thing is watershed health, environment, and recreation. The water plan sets a measurable objective to cover 80% of the locally prioritized lists of rivers and stream management plans, and 80% of critical watersheds with watershed protection plans, all by 2030. Currently, we're at about 47% for stream management plans, so that's a pretty big jump. And then in terms of prioritized list of rivers, there's 2. So that's a big jump. So, and the big one, storage. So I'm going to delve into this with a little bit more detail. So the water plan sets a measurable objective of obtaining 400,000 acre-feet of water storage in order to manage and share conserved water and the yield of IPMPs by 2050. This objective equates to an 80% success rate for these planned projects. I think if you've been in this conversation for a while, we've been talking about the success of IPMPs, those identified planned projects. And we've been talking about those, and the discussion has been, it's important that these projects go through and the timing of that. So we looked at attacking this from 2 different angles, so I get to get in a little more detail on this because this is my pet project. And I know it's a contentious one. So you look at storage, and we attacked it from 2 different angles. The first, in terms of permitting, and that was something that we're looking at our current permitting process taking a little too long in the state. How many agree with just a little bit too long? How many agree with a lot too long? How many agree with really, really expensive? Okay, so we had to look at that, and so. One of the things, the first way we attack this is on funding. Are we currently using the funds that we already have out there in an appropriate fashion? Are they being most efficiently used to move us towards a good water future? And so we looked at the measurable objective and said, okay, let's look at how we're spending our money. So that's in there. I'm not going to go through these slides and read them, but a lot of it is, are we implementing our basin implementation plans? Is the money being spent on things that are already talked about and there's some consensus on? And then we looked at the permitting process, and the whole way through the water plan I talked about it's easy to throw stones to the federal government or to stakeholder groups, but when it came to permitting, we wanted to look at ourselves first because any good therapist will tell you you need to look at your own issues before you throw stones at others. So we really did that, I think. But maybe a therapist would disagree. But we really looked at the current way that we're going through the NEPA process as it relates to water projects. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I am saying maybe there's some opportunities for improvement. And one of those was that, again, looking at ourselves first. Are we as state agencies being most efficient in how we communicate with each other? Are we being most efficient when we get involved? Are our processes that are already out there communicating within each other? And so the top of the slide is kind of the current way that we're doing it, and the bottom of the slide is some of the proposed ideas. So the biggest proposal was probably that we front load and communicate a little bit earlier, but also that we look at state agencies so that there's not a miscommunication between state agencies, and we're singing off the same song page. And so we're not conflicting ourselves, because when two agencies that are brother or sister agencies conflict, then someone else has to make a decision. And as a state, we wanted to be able to make our own recommendations on how to move forward. So that was a big way that we attacked. And then we looked at state values and support. So as we move forward and look at projects and where we invest time, energy, and funding, we want to make sure that these projects have a commitment to collaboration. They address an identified gap. That's hugely important. They demonstrate sustainability. And then there's also the fiscal and technical feasibility that's really important as we move forward. So those will be like the first view that we look at as from the state's perspective, and say, okay, how much energy and effort and time are we going to spend on this? And we'll look at it through that lens, and then we'll add some additional lenses as we move forward. I wanna turn it over to Jacob Bornstein. Monday is his last day, and he's worked with me for the last 3 years through this process, and so it's a huge loss, but he was a big part of a lot of things that have moved us forward in these measurable objectives, I think. And one of them is the conceptual framework, and then that other spoke or wedge of the wheel that I talked about in terms of funding and getting a little more detail. So I talked about our current funding, and he'll talk about some of the ideas that came out in the water plan that were expanding funding resources and things like that. So I'm going to bring Jacob up, and then I'll close it up.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you all. Okay, so the conceptual framework, who knows what that is? Okay, so for those who don't, that's sort of code word for how we're thinking about future Trans Mountain diversions. Not the ones that are already on the books, those already identified projects like Moffett and Windy Gap and full use of existing systems, but future ones. How can we build a framework to think about that? And the Interbasin Compact Committee really thought about this very hard for very, very long, and I was happy to be part of that. I only have one real slide to show you. Eric Kuhn, are you still in the audience somewhere? I saw you somewhere. He called these 7 points in the conceptual framework 7 points of light, and I tried to find an image that captured that. These are sort of the 7 points in brief. One important thing is there are some things in the framework that we need to move forward immediately. We already talked about the environment. So building environmental resiliency with or without a new Trans Mountain diversion is important for setting the groundwork for that potential. In addition, conservation and efficiency, Becky and Kevin talked about that, so that's an important piece. And building a collaborative program amongst water users to help prevent compact curtailment on the Colorado River is something else that we really need to move forward with or without a new Trans Mountain diversion in order to lay the groundwork for that even being a possibility in the future. So that's a conceptual framework in a nutshell, except for one thing. Our speaker, Andre Van Hall, talked about the four-way test, and I had a Rotarian give me a little coin. Apparently they give coins out with the four-way test on the back of it. And I was looking at this, is it the truth? Is it fair? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? And I think that's really what the IBCC was trying to do here with the conceptual framework and all the roundtables supporting it. So that's that. And now to move on funding. Funding is a really important topic. So much of the water plan is dependent on funding. Right now, the current state budget for water receives less than 1% of the total state budget. And even by increasing that by 0.5%, we could actually tackle the major funding initiatives that need to happen in the water plan. Another 100 million or so a year, 3 billion by 2050. So that's really what we're talking about. It will probably take some type of initiative or something like that. So this is not an easy task given our fiscal knot and crisis in the state, but it's a small percentage of the state budget that could have a real impact. So I want to focus on number 5, as Becky said. What is the funding plan of the future that integrates all of these things? One way that we can encourage multi-purpose and regional types of projects is by having a type of guarantee repayment fund where all the different water providers participating in, say, a WISE type of project or a Windy Gap type of project would have a level playing field because they'd all be at the same credit rating and then be able to bundle together the project in terms of a finance package. And if the state could back those private bonds, then we'd be able to do that. And maybe we can cycle that into a green bond program to pay for the environmental and recreational needs while supporting agriculture, planning, and all the other priorities of the plan. So let's get into that a little bit. So when we're talking about how many projects, how much money do we need in the future, we know that the $14 to $16 billion of projects that we need, the state's not going to pay for all of that. Water providers will find ways to finance that. But in order to provide a 10% guarantee loan for those, we'd need $1.4 to $1.6 billion between now and 2050. On the environmental side, we see a $2 to $3 billion total need out there. And we need about 75% of the costs. Environmental groups and other organizations will provide some other costs. But at the state, we need about that much. So there's a whole other list. Alternative transfer methods for agriculture, incentives to implement conservation, paying for upfront costs of planning when you're building a water project, agricultural viability, funding water education and outreach. Those all have price tags that add up pretty quickly. So how do we do this? This is just conceptual. We don't have all the answers, what the source of fund is. We're going to go through a process with the Sustainable Funding Committee, which some of you are on, as well as the Interbasin Compact Committee to really find out how we're going to get the funds. And there's a bunch of ideas. I'm not going to go into detail. They have a wide range. And then exactly how we make that pitch to the public. But how we use that funds, the CWC currently has some initial funds that we would like to invest in a repayment guarantee fund and education grants. And then that, as the repayment guarantee fund is drawn down, as those bonds are repaid, then you can recycle that into green bonds. At the same time, for some of the other priorities, all of the existing funds can be used to prioritize for agricultural viability and other water plan priorities. While we're doing this and testing the success of how this could be operated, a new source of funds, perhaps 100 million a year or so, 3 billion over 30 years, which is about what we need based off of those previous figures, we could really have those planning, incentives, all of those things in that 930 million or rounding up to $1 billion would be in there. And then we'd have $2 billion of repayment guarantee funds that could leverage $20 billion worth of projects, and then that would recycle into $2 billion of environmental and recreational projects. So that's sort of the vision of how we could use the smallest amount of funds, just 0.5% of the state budget more, to really be able to implement the major priorities of the water plan. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Becky to talk about implementation.
That was Jacob's farewell tour with the CWCB. So Maybe I'll get them back someday. So finally, we're working on the implementation of the plan at the state level. And so I think you've heard me talk about that a little bit, about how we're measured, and that's the benefit of the measurable objectives, is the key word is measurable. And so hopefully we'll be hearing next year that we've made some progress, and we'll be able to stand up here and say, okay, good work, we're a little bit ahead, or we're a little bit behind, we have to focus. So each basin roundtable is continuing to work on their basin implementation plans. Some are working harder than others, some are more focused on projects, some are more focused on education and outreach. Every basin is doing it in their own way, kind of like they've done everything thus far, is in their own way. That's the beauty of the state of Colorado. We're all kind of different, and we're all the same at the same time. All of our wedges touch each other, I guess. And then a big part of the implementation rests on SWASI, which is the statewide water supply initiative. And so the update has begun on that. And that's going to be a big piece at moving forward. So we're getting moving already. We hit the ground running. And then again, it starts here. As with the water plan, it was really built as a ground up process. So it begins with you. It begins with the people in this room. We expect that everybody here plays a part in how we implement. And again, stay engaged, stay involved. Our websites are still up. We're still taking comments for the next water plan. So we've already had a few for our next water plan. So you're not the first, even if you submitted today for the next water plan. So I just want to say thank you all for allowing us to be here, and thanks for your work thus far.